This is Distant Replay.
Well, it's time to wrap up our conversation on James Jordan, the true crime sports series that we've done the last few weeks. This is part 3. We started off by giving you the details of how everything happened, how everything unfolded. Then we talked about the trial in part 2. And now we're going to kind of tie up some loose ends, but also kind of bring you up to speed present day in 2021 and kind of where everybody is right now, but also some conspiracy theories that are out there revolving around James Jordan's death. So that's the plan today on Distant Replay. Mike, you ready to close the book on this one?
Yeah, Ben, I'm ready to close the book on this one. The response to this episode has been great, and looking forward to closing it out and moving on to some more cases.
So if you haven't joined us yet, you can make sure to check us out on YouTube and any podcasting app that you prefer to listen to. We're doing true crime every week. We're doing documentary recaps as well, plus a game we go back and watch as well. So 3 episodes every week. So you have to go back a few episodes to find part 1 and part 2, but recommend you go back and listen to those. Before you get to this one, I'll kind of give you a little more clarity on where we are before we start this episode. So let's jump into it, Mike. Where do you want to begin on this kind of closing chapter?
Well, I think it's important. We discussed the Jordan family and Michael Jordan way at the beginning of part 1 of this little series we're doing. Just in general, the reason why they didn't come up much, the rest of the story regarding, the trial of Larry Demery and Daniel Green and in the media coverage is because they purposely stayed out of the press during the trial because they did not want to interfere. And obviously a very traumatic time for the family, but they purposely stayed out of the limelight. Whenever someone did need to talk for the family, which wasn't often, it was Michael's older brother, Larry, that would talk for the family.
Yeah.
Now, the only interview I could find where I could find Michael Jordan talking about the trial and talking about the murder of his father was from an Oprah interview in 1993. So that would put us obviously after the murders, but before the trial. And you could tell, this is only like 3 months-ish after the murder happened, and he still hadn't come to grips with it, And he had a very tough time talking to Oprah about it, like pretty much hitting the point home that, he's not even sure if he wants to know why they did it because none of it would make sense to him even if he found out,
Yeah.
Very emotional and very kind of, Michael Jordan's always sure of himself and knows exactly what to say all the time.
Yeah, very confident.
But in this case, he wasn't. You could tell he was a little bit rattled, and who can blame him,
Yeah, we can all relate to that as well. I think I kind of remember that interview a little bit because, Oprah was obviously a pretty big deal. She booked some big guests, but it's also during a time period where, you had just a handful of places where celebrities could appear, right? They had to jump on these big platforms where the nation would watch. It's not like now where, you could catch Jordan on a YouTube interview, not necessarily him. He'd have his own channel and such, but you know what I mean? You could find him on all kinds of platforms. Back then it was like one location. So that was an interview everybody was tuned into.
Yeah. And the fact of the matter is Jordan was the most popular athlete in the world based in Chicago. Yep. Oprah Winfrey was the most popular media personality back then, also based in Chicago. So, yep. Kind of a perfect storm in that respect. So that's sort of like the Jordan family, Michael Jordan, just to kind of put a bow on them and during this series. Now, next I want to discuss Larry Demery. So Larry Demery, of course, Daniel Green's co-defendant in the murder trial of James Jordan. If you remember, he pled guilty to first-degree murder on the basically wink-wink promise from the prosecutors that they would recommend he not get the death sentence, right? Mm-hmm. So Larry Demery, what I learned by looking into him a little bit more, from the end of the trial till now is his story has constantly changed over the years. Like,
surprise.
Yeah, exactly. And you would think that, if he was telling the truth, there would only be one truth, and that whatever he told everywhere he went, it'd be the same story. So that's one thing you notice when you research any time you've heard from him in the last 25 years. He's actually admitted to multiple people that he's pulled the trigger, but that he pulled the trigger that night, but he's never admitted it. He's
where do those conversations take place? Like, just kind of, I don't know if they're actually anywhere you can listen to, but kind of what's the setting for those kind of admittals?
Yeah, so there's not any, like, it's not on audio, but like there was a media person who talked to him that he told that to, supposedly, a local reporter from down in Robeson County.
Gotcha.
There's a lady who I'm going to get to here a little bit later who's been working trying to free Daniel Green, like an Innocence Project type of lawyer. She's a lawyer for the wrongly convicted, or people who she feels are wrongly convicted. And she says that Larry Demery, didn't say he did it, but said Daniel Green didn't do it. If that makes sense.
Right.
So his story has changed a lot over the years. He's admitted to people he's pulled the trigger. He's admitted to people that Daniel Green did not pull the trigger. And the most important news development from Larry Demery is he was granted parole and he's getting out in 2023.
Wow. So just over a year from now.
Yeah. And I've never heard of this, Ben. So he was granted parole, I believe sometime in 2019 or 2020, but he doesn't get out till 2023. I've never heard of that.
Oh, yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, it just shows how all these cases are so different. All these state statutes are so different. But it seems strange to me that, 2-3 years after he's granted parole is when he actually gets out.
Yeah, can you imagine getting granted parole, then you're still a half a decade in prison?
Yeah. It's just that just seems strange to me. I'm sure there's some kind of legal reason why.
I'm sure.
All right, so the next thing I want to get to, Ben, is Daniel Green's appeals, right? So obviously it's pretty clear. Daniel Green says, I disposed of the body. I rode around in Mr. Jordan's Lexus afterwards. I stole his things that were in his car and on his person, but I did not kill him, okay? I was not the trigger man. I was not even there when he was murdered. Now, that's an important thing to clarify in North Carolina, Ben, because in North Carolina, the person who if someone pulls a trigger and kills someone and someone is there as an accomplice, they are both guilty of that crime.
Okay.
Does that make sense? I don't get any more, I don't get any more, we're still convicted of first-degree murder in this case.
Equal charges, essentially.
Yeah, equal charges. So that's important to clarify that he also says, not only was I not the trigger man, but I wasn't even there.
Okay.
So now Daniel Green's appeal is done by a lady named Christine Muma, okay? And I saw a documentary which she appeared. She appeared in that IMDb documentary, that Moment of Truth documentary that I mentioned in part 1. And she basically based his appeal on the following evidence, okay? The fact that there was no blood found in James Jordan's car, which contradicts Larry Demery's story, right? That the murder happened in the car. Yeah. That Daniel Green went up to the car to rob James Jordan. James Jordan woke up and Daniel Green shot him in the car, right?
But during the trial they did say that that's possible, though, right? That there could be no blood.
Exactly, that they could shoot and the bullet could get lodged, yes. But another reason they don't believe it happened, like Larry Demery said, was a couple other reasons. She had a ballistics expert test the trajectory of the bullet as Larry Demery described. So Larry Demery had to describe, hey, this is where Daniel was standing when he shot Mr. Jordan. They recreated the whole scene, and that this ballistics expert, I don't want to say testified, but, put in writing so she could submit it for the appeal process, that the way Larry Demery described the crime happened, it could not have happened that way based on the trajectory of the bullet and how he said it traveled into Mr. Jordan, right? So that's another sort of check mark as far as eliminating that the crime happened in the car.
Okay.
Now, the last thing from the car is there was concerns about tampering of Mr. Jordan's shirt. When a medical examiner examined James Jordan's body, remember, James Jordan was in a body of water for about 2 weeks before his body was discovered. He noted no bullet holes in the shirt during the autopsy. Okay, so remember, in order for Larry Demery's version of events to fit, there has to be some kind of bullet hole on Mr. Jordan somewhere in his shirt, right?
Yeah.
If he was shot either in the chest or the stomach or what have you. So there's no bullet holes in the shirt during the autopsy, but then at trial, there was a hole in Mr. Jordan's shirt that they presented as evidence for how the crime happened.
Okay, that's odd.
Very odd. So that's another sort of check mark why this lady, Christine Muma, feels that, hey, look, it couldn't have happened the way Larry Demery said it did.
So I guess they just did not talk to the medical examiner, or just did not have that information shared during the trial, because that seems like a pretty big discrepancy.
Good point. So the basis of the appeal, the appeal has to be based on something, right?
Yeah.
What is ineffectiveness of counsel. Okay. So basically saying, hey, look, the fact that all this stuff wasn't brought up by the original defense lawyer is why you should grant Daniel Green an appeal so we could formally present are evidence as to why we can proclaim his innocence.
Right. Okay. Makes sense.
Now, the biggest bombshell, if you actually research the appeal, is, well, you remember the cell phone that was a big part of the evidence, the car phone that they said that Daniel and Larry made calls from in Mr. Jordan's Lexus?
Yep.
Well, one of the calls from that car phone was made to a known drug dealer who was the biological son of the Robeson County Sheriff, a man named Hubert Stone.
Okay.
Now, we'll get to Robeson County in the next little section here and their issues with distrust of law enforcement in that county because of how they did things there for a really long time. But basically, you had a biological son of the sheriff. So when I say biological son, he was a son out of wedlock that Hubert Stone had that not many people knew he was Hubert Stone's biological son.
Okay.
But Hubert Stone knew it, right?
Right.
It's not like it was a son that he never knew he had.
Yeah.
Okay. And the reason why this was brought up in the appeal was there was like 145 interviews done in relationship to this case, including this drug dealer who was the sheriff's biological son. Out of the 145 interviews that were done, only 144 of them have records. The only one that doesn't is the interview of the sheriff's son.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Just a coincidence, huh?
Yeah, exactly. So that's another sort of, hey, this is why we feel Daniel Green should be given a hearing to see, to try to prove his innocence. He met with, and like I said before, the meeting with Larry Demery also was brought up in this appeal evidence process where, hey, look, Larry Demery met with this Christine Muma and said that things did not happen the way that he testified to. And that Larry Demery only testified the way he did because he felt immense pressure from law enforcement.
Okay.
All right, that law enforcement basically told him the version of the story that he needed to tell for Larry Demery to be given that, wink, wink deal I talked about before.
Yeah.
Now, with all of this evidence, all they were doing during the appeals process is trying to get an official hearing to present all the evidence they have formally to an appeals court and for them to sort of rule on whether Daniel should be granted a new trial, should be proclaimed innocent, what have you, right? Mm-hmm. So they present their application for an appeal. And as of now, all of Daniel's appeals have been denied. So he's still in jail. All of his appeals have been denied. I think the next step for Daniel Green is his appeal is going to go before the North Carolina Supreme Court. And then if that gets denied, his appeal would they would try to appeal to the Supreme Court. Okay. You see that a lot, Ben. I don't know how many true crime podcasts you've listened to that have discussed cases like this, but that's basically usually the process. You appeal it at a local level, you appeal it at a state level, and then if those don't get through, you appeal it at the Supreme Court level. Remember we discussed a little bit of that with Greg Kelly.
Yeah.
Remember when we did the Outcry documentary?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the stage they're at with Daniel right now. So that's where Daniel Green is right now. He's still in jail. Okay.
Interesting. Okay.
Now Robeson County, and by the way, before I put a bow on Daniel Green, the prosecutor, still is adamant that he feels that Daniel Green is the one who pulled the trigger. So, now, Robeson County, I already mentioned, as far as it connects to this case in particular, the connection with Hubert Stone's son, his interview disappearing, and it being the only one from the entire investigation, right? I had mentioned before in the previous parts how there's a history of conflict between the white, black, and Native American communities within Robeson County.
Right. And
their tremendous distrust of law enforcement. Okay. This Hubert Stone, the one I mentioned before, who was a sheriff for a very long period of time. A lot of controversy surrounding him and his sheriff deputies and the way they did business and the way they ran, their law enforcement office. Now, the distrust of law enforcement, the history of conflict between the white, black, and Native American communities, well documented in Robeson County. I went over it in previous episodes. That distrust comes from some very high-profile incidents that happened, and most notably within the decade leading up to the the murder of James Jordan, right? So you had a very high profile district attorney race happening in which it looked like a minority candidate was going to win. And then that minority candidate dying of very suspicious circumstances, like shot and murdered very suspiciously.
Yeah.
And a crime that's like has never been solved kind of thing. That made people raise some eyebrows. You had in 2002, so we're talking about 5-6 years after the Daniel Green trial, there was an operation called Operation Tarnished Badge that exposed a lot of corruption in the Robeson County Sheriff's Office, and 22 deputies ended up being convicted of various crimes, including drug dealing and money laundering. And Johnson Britt, the same prosecutor who prosecuted Daniel Green, also is the one who brought these charges against the Robeson County Sheriff's Office. So just a lot of distrust in that county.
Yeah.
It all seems to be along racial lines, all of it.
Yeah. I'm surprised that none of that was tied back to this case at all. In terms of the appeal process, it's just interesting.
I think it ties back to more the fact that people question the way the investigation was done.
Yeah.
People question the way, what was done with Larry Demery getting the favorable treatment. People are, it maybe not be something that came up in court, but there's kind of like undertones that, hey, look, we can't trust our law enforcement to do things the way, to do things fairly,
Okay.
And all these incidents kind of hinted to that. Now the conspiracy theories here, okay? I couldn't find anything to substantiate anything that tied this crime to Michael Jordan's gambling, right?
Yeah, that's always the popular one, right?
Yeah, because what you had is Michael Jordan retires from basketball, as we all know, to go play baseball very shortly here after his father's death, right? And the conspiracy theory is that not only is the murder of his father tied to his gambling, but also his retirement from the NBA so abruptly was tied to David Stern basically telling him, hey, look, I can either suspend you or you can just go away for a couple years because of the gambling, right?
Yeah.
None of this stuff has ever been substantiated, but it's just rumors that go around. Now, one thing that's not a conspiracy theory is that Daniel Green still says that Larry shot James Jordan over a drug deal gone bad. And that Larry won't admit that because then it proves Daniel's case, right? That he wasn't there when the crime happened.
Yeah.
And that the crime didn't happen in the car, most importantly. So, what Daniel says is that Larry told him James Jordan did make his way to that hotel that we talked about that was right near where he pulled his car over. James Jordan went there looking for drugs. That's where he encountered Larry, who was involved in a drug trade. They had a disagreement over something, and Larry shot James Jordan. So that's still Daniel's story to this day. His story has never changed. He said he wants to bring peace to the Jordan family, but he can't cop to a crime he says he didn't commit. So, yeah. And Ben, I'll tell you, we've done a lot of these true crime episodes now, and this is one I've looked into the most and the only one where I can't stand on the table and say, I think this happened. I honestly have no clue what happened still.
Very interesting stuff. I'm sure there's plenty to read and research if you want to go deep into this, right?
There's a ton. There's the 5-part documentary on IMDb TV entitled A Moment of Truth, which is very good. I recommend that. There's obviously countless news stories on it as well around the internet. And, you can take a deep dive into this case if you want to. The fact of the matter is Daniel Green is still in jail for this crime. Larry Demery getting out on parole, like we said, in a couple of years. And I'll be interested to see if Daniel Green's appeals ever go anywhere, so we could actually see all of this evidence that his lawyers think they have presented in front of a court and see what happens.
Yeah, it would get really interesting then if that happened. I don't know if it will or not. It doesn't seem like it will, but if it does, we'll definitely keep an eye out and maybe even update a podcast down the road. But Mike, I appreciate you going through this. This is a really good, 3-part series, a little bit longer, but I think it's important to kind of break down each element in each kind of section of this case.
Yeah, it was. There was a lot of parts to it that I wanted to go over, and to be honest, I wanted to try a multi-part little series here and see how it went.
Yeah.
So hopefully the audience liked it. Next week, we'll be back to your suggestions, just like this James Jordan one was a suggestion. We'll be back to the suggestions. Keep them coming, please, because that's the best source of ideas for episodes that we get. And thanks as always.
Definitely. Find us on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and distantreplaypodcast.com. We'll talk to you again on the next episode.